Let me bring on a Pulitzer Prize winner, the co-founder of DCReport.org. He has written books, best-selling books on Trump, on the wealthiest Americans, how they manipulate the tax system, and essentially how they are coddled by this government. You're going to see a coddling unlike anything I think that has ever preceded it in this new Trump administration. Let's talk to him about what's happening. This is the great David K. Johnston, everyone. Hi,
Hello,
David.
Mark.
So, David, first I want to check off on something with you. And then I want to get to the appointments and how things are unfolding. The thing I want to check off with on the election is associated with some kind of manipulation of the outcome, whether you are accepting of the outcome, whether you feel a paper recount should be required, given the fact that there are any clouds of controversy around it. Where are you on that issue?
Well, Donald Trump has inculcated a lot of America with his conspiracy theory that the 2020 election was stolen, even though there's no evidence of it. And he and his confreres had 60 opportunities in court, and they couldn't once come up with evidence. There is some evidence of people voting 2 or more times for Donald Trump in 2020 and 2016, but those were insignificant numbers of people. What's unfortunate is that a lot of people who support Kamala Harris have now bought into that same conspiracy. Dr. Bandy Lee was a Yale psychiatry professor, a tenured professor, someone I knew, and she was fired by Yale for saying that Donald Trump was mentally ill. And much of her work was about how mental illness, just like a physical illness, can spread. Her research showed that followers will adopt the mental illness of a leader. What we're now seeing is something she said also could happen. The mental illness of the leader can be transferred to people who are opposed to the leader. There's no evidence whatsoever of fraud in this election. What there is evidence of is about 13 million fewer people turned out to vote. The Democrats did not do nearly as well as the Republicans in getting out the vote. And one of the unknown questions that will take a long time, but social scientists will eventually give us an answer, is did the vote fall because a lot of people felt, yeah, the country's fine. I don't need to oust the current administration and its replacement, Kamala Harris? Or did they stay home because they said, gee, this is just really awful. I can't imagine Trump. I mean, what are the reasons of the people who didn't vote? But you get out the vote, you win. Donald won. He did not, let me be clear, win a mandate. He won by one of the narrowest margins in the history of the Republic. When all the votes are counted, it will come in at 2%, maybe under 2% margin of victory. That is not a mandate, and not all of his candidates won. I mean, we saw the first transgender senator elected. We saw a number of ballot items that are completely contrary to MAGA pass by voters and by large margins. So don't buy the nonsense, the big lie that this is a mandate.
Could, when it comes to these controversial, is a, I think, polite way to put it, appointments that Donald Trump has offered, could he safely bypass the confirmation process? And doesn't that seem like a likely narrative if indeed he could?
Well, so the framers of our Constitution, the first modern democracy, were very concerned about people getting taken up in the moment, about mob rule. So they made it very difficult to make change. They allowed for change, but made it very difficult. And one of the controls they put on the executive was that principal officers, which means cabinet members, have to be approved by the U.S. Senate, the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, for the first 100 years in this country, often they didn't even hold a meeting. They just had a floor meeting and by acclaim accepted appointments to the Supreme Court and other positions. Trump is trying right now to establish that he is supreme and no Republican will challenge him. That's what he's trying to do. This is an obedience test. Senator Thune, the incoming majority leader, and other Republican senators, you will do what I say. And either they will stand up for the prerogatives of the Senate and the Constitution, or they will bow down to Donald Trump. And this will be a great test. If he succeeds in getting them to go into recess, which they can only do with the cooperation of the House, but that won't be hard to do, so that he can appoint these people for up to 2 years, that will be a real sign of a coming dictatorial regime. It will only take a handful of Republican senators, it looks like there'll be 53 Republicans out of the 100 senators, to insist that they hold hearings. And in the case of Matt Gaetz, Pete Hegseth, both of whom are manifestly unqualified, but more importantly, have serious moral character defects that in any other administration they wouldn't even be considered. It strikes me that it would be foolhardy of John Thune and other senators to bow down to Donald on this. They should allow the process to go forward. But keep in mind, this is a loyalty test to Donald Trump. You know, James Comey flunked the loyalty test. He was fired. Anybody who is around Donald and all the years that I've known him, you know, if you don't bend to Donald's will, you'll be out sooner or later, usually sooner.
Yeah, and that threat is something that is being offered up now, as you say, in this effort to push this through one way or another. It's being communicated. If you go up against the president-elect's desires to get his staff in place, we will primary you. We will get rid of you. And right. He's done it before. I mean, I don't know to what extent, you know, he could successfully do it again. But as you say, this first test really, it's offered up in the shadow of an extremely difficult appointee. I mean, the Matt Gaetz appointment, David, is fraught with so many issues. I mean, you've got paid sex with underage women. You've got the receipts. You've got Venmo trail to actually show that it actually happened. You have witnesses to state that it actually happened. So, I mean, leave aside the fact that, you know, Matt Gaetz couldn't find the men's room at the Justice Department. I mean, he's never been in the place, probably, and he was barely a lawyer. He's going to run the Justice Department, and Donald Trump seems committed to dying on this hill.
Well, if he doesn't get Matt Gaetz, he will find somebody else who will do what Donald wants. And what Donald wants is prosecutions of people he perceives as his enemies. He wants to harass out of business the New York Times. He's going to try and find a way to get the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse a decision known as Times v. Sullivan. That's a 1964 decision over an advertisement in the New York Times about the racist way that the Montgomery, Alabama government was treating Black people seeking the right to vote. And it had a couple of minor factual errors in it. And the Supreme Court in that case held that public figures, so you and me, senators, politicians, but not some random person who happened to witness a crime because they were driving down the street, that public figures cannot sue for damages unless you can show what's called actual malice. That is, the journalist knew something was false and they published it anyway. You're never going to win a case on actual malice against the New York Times. There's, you know, so many editors weigh in, and this is true of any significant news organization. It's just not going to happen. There is no actual malice. There are stories you don't like. And remember, Donald Trump said many times, he said to me many times directly, you shouldn't be allowed to write something about me unless I approve it. That's not a free country. That's a dictatorship. But if Matt Gaetz can't do that for him in the Justice Department, he will find somebody else who's not as disgusting. I don't know what other word to use for Matt Gaetz, who went around showing pictures of young women on the floor of the House saying, hey, you know, I did it with that one last night. Gaetz is hated by a lot of Republicans in the House, and Trump in doing this is seeing just how far he can push his loyalty demands. You're also going to see Trump in the military try to court-martial and punish General Mark Milley, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs, and a number of other generals. He's talked about charging them under the Uniform Code of Military Justice with treason, which is ridiculous on its face, but they can come up with a charge to put these guys in the stockade. The difficulty there he will have is those generals and admirals will be tried by other military officers. And I doubt that they will go along with Donald Trump's effort to intimidate the military into being his personal army.
Couldn't he, on that, couldn't Trump do what he did to Vindman, let's say, Vindman, who testified in the first impeachment trial on the Ukraine call? He basically busted him out of government before his retirement could kick in. I mean, he took his own kind of revenge in those ways. Could he mess with, just because we're on the military thing, could he mess with some of these distinguished military figures?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, the president can fire any military officer at his choice. He's the commander in chief. He can block the promotion of an officer, and if you get blocked twice, you're out. He can recall any officer under the age of 70. If you become an officer of the United States military, you are subject to recall until you're 70. So General Milley is in his 60s. They can call him back to court-martial him. He can destroy the esprit de corps and the respect for the Constitution that we have very carefully built into our military, on which we spend an enormous amount of money on education. Many senior officers in the military have doctoral degrees in their fields of study. I've interviewed many general officers of the U.S. military over my career, and more than a few of them I walked away and went, what a jerk. But I've never walked away from one and said, that's a raging incompetent. How did that person get promoted? 9 years ago, maybe it was 8 years ago, but back before the first Trump administration, I said and wrote that if Donald Trump starts firing senior officers in the military and promoting colonels, majors, and captains out of order, you should be very scared, because that is the sign of a military dictatorship. And there are always junior officers who will sell out their country for their own vainglorious needs and their ideology. They get weeded out as you move up into the military. Racist captains or lieutenants and captains who discriminate openly don't make it to general officer. They get weeded out no matter how good they may be at their technical knowledge.
So because we're on the military, I'll just touch on Hegseth, a guy who it seems is utterly incompetent. I mean, I always think of the Pentagon and managing the massive employee base that underpins the Pentagon and the Department of Defense as a management nightmare. You'd need to have some kind of significant administrative background to be able to handle this. This guy, Hegseth, has none of that. I get it. He had distinguished military service, perhaps, but I mean, then he could run a platoon or whatever it is. But I don't see how this works. He was bound, so just on background, just to remind everybody, for this tattoo, this Deus Vult tattoo, because he was there in a protective, I think, protective detail vis-a-vis the Biden administration, and they weren't comfortable with that. I mean, leaving the tattoo aside, David, although it's been, co-opted, I guess, by white supremacists, and Proud Boys have that tattoo, and 3%ers have that tattoo. I don't know if he's either one of those things, but he does seem manifestly incompetent as a weekend Fox host to run the Department of Defense. Will he ascend in your handicapping the situation to that post, or will, as you say, there'll be somebody behind him who might be better suited?
Well, this is another loyalty test by Trump. Will the Senate bow to his will? And we don't know. He has no management experience. He was in the National Guard. He wasn't in the regular army, although he did serve a tour. The tattoo that he's wearing should itself be disqualifying. I mean, if you go to the trouble of getting a painful tattoo that declares to the world your white supremacist views, you have no business being the civilian head of the Defense Department. It's too bad that we don't require cabinet officers to take what's called a desk test. civil service systems with promotions do something where they put you in a room and they give you like 17 things you have to do in so many minutes, and there's no way you can do it. It's a test of, do you crumble? Do you make smart choices? Do you defer those things that can be deferred? That is, do you recognize those that are, the house is on fire, from those that are, well, we got to get to this, but not at the moment. And I have no doubt that Hegseth and Matt Gaetz would fail such a test. But yeah, Trump will find somebody else if he doesn't get him. And, you know, Saturday Night Live on the Weekend Update had a very funny line about this. Colin Jost came on and showed Gaetz, Hegseth, and one other appointee and said, Donald Trump is announcing the people he's going to fire in 6 months. And, you know, he will get rid of these people for one reason or another, unless they absolutely are totally obsequious to him. Or in a few cases, they may be women who know how to manipulate him, and they will hang on longer, but it requires a great deal of skill. Maggie Haberman of the New York Times has been brilliant at manipulating Donald and getting him. I know a lot of people listening to the show think she's terrible. She's not. She's a genius. She is the one who's gotten him to say all sorts of things that were suspected but not on the record. And Donald is, Donald is like the, never mind.
I mean, he does. She's sort of the Trump whisperer at the moment.
Yes, and Donald just has real issues with women that he's subject, just as he is by dictators like Kim and Putin and Xi, to flattery and manipulation, and because he's a hollow vessel. But you know, the bad decisions he's going to make, let him make them. Let Trump be Trump. Give him his appointments and then see what happens, because these things shouldn't work out and they should blow up in his face. And maybe some of the people who bought the con, the marks who voted for him, they will come to realize that this is all a facade. The man is a con artist and a bully.
You are uniquely, perhaps, situated to comment on this, and that is the rise of Elon Musk as sort of, I think he sees himself as a co-president almost, the way he is at every meeting. He's on significant calls right now. And again, Trump isn't even president yet. And he really did help win this election for Donald Trump with his money, with his ideas, with et cetera. So my question, and this is why I say you're uniquely positioned to answer this, how long before that relationship becomes frayed? And I just remind everyone that Musk has significant contracts with the government. I mean, massive contracts that will only get more massive now under the Trump administration. So Trump can be, in a way, the guy who's seen as having leverage right now, although depending on how you play it, the government needs Musk, and Musk could be seen as having leverage. So it's an interesting relationship that's evolving here, David.
Well, this is the very definition of the corruption the framers of our Constitution worried about. They recognize there'd always be individual venality. There'd be the federal judge in Corpus Christi, Texas, who was manipulating divorced women in custody fights over their children to get sex by threatening to fire them so they'd then lose their children. That kind of corruption. What they were worried about was institutionalizing corruption. And we've been doing this for years now. The Supreme Court has passed, as I mentioned on an earlier show of yours, a series of decisions that have basically made bribery of public officials lawful unless you're stupid enough to say, here's a bribe. And so looking at our current situation, we need to recognize that Donald keeps people as long as they are useful to him. Musk's big risk right now is that he'll get in front of Donald. He'll in some way put a shadow on Donald or take away a bit of the light. People who are smart, when Donald calls them to the stage in his campaign rallies, they get up, they speak briefly, they just talk about how wonderful he is, and they slip away. Musk is not like that. He is very much like Donald. And remember, Musk is not a great genius. He didn't create Tesla. He wrested control of the company from its founders. He didn't create SpaceX. He's just a guy who is the far outlier of hitting the jackpot in the stock market again and again and again. And that's why he has all this money. If I were the Boeing company, which competes with Musk in aerospace, I would be very worried. I'm sure Musk wants to do everything he can to hobble them and get in the way. And Donald will, keep Musk and every other one of these people up to the point that in his very jumbled mind, he needs to get rid of him. And then he will.
That is really going to be one that'll be interesting to watch because, as I say, there's so many interests on both sides, But the personal side of it is, I knew you'd have the key point, which is watch the limelight, because if you get into Trump's limelight, he will get rid of you one way or
Absolutely.
the other.
One of the things we should
ahead.
worry about, Mark, just 1 second. Judge Marchand today in the criminal case in New York got the report from the New York District Attorney on what do we do. And the New York District Attorney, Alvin Bragg's office, said, well, given the unique circumstances, we shouldn't certainly throw out a case where a jury has ruled. We should defer sentencing. I don't think that's right. I think you should defer imposition of the sentence. And I may have misread, because I did it in a hurry just before we came on the air, the filing. But Donald Trump should be sentenced by Judge Marchand for his felonies, with the imposition of the sentence stayed until January 21st of 2029.
Yeah, in a way, I suppose that falls into the category of, all of this stuff. Put it on the back burner, but the back burner is so far away that, we likely will never see it. But your point is...
It's a desk set test.
Yeah. So I have a question about an economic thing, and I thought maybe you could bring it to light, or just at least give us a state of the state on this. There's a lot of conversation and a kind of tug of war going on over the Treasury appointment. And leave aside the personalities involved, although I'm sure that those are very important. I mean, everybody is sort of supplicative, and and they're all in their own way, sucking up to Trump. But more to the point, there's a fork in the road here when it comes to crypto. There is a big move in this new Trump administration, surrounded by tech bros as he is, to bring crypto into a sense of legitimacy in the American government that we've never seen before. Can you speak to that and just that effect on the economy a little bit?
Yeah, there are some people who become incredibly rich because there was a time when you could buy Bitcoin for a fraction of a penny, and it's now selling at about $92,000 per Bitcoin. So there are some people who've gotten very rich, but there's a huge number of people who have not done well in Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is fake money. The US dollar bill is the most accepted anywhere in the world. If you go to Argentina, which has a terrible economy and a terrible monetary system, with $1 and $5 and $10 bills in your pocket, you can get huge discounts. You go to Egypt, you can get huge discounts from people. They'll give you 10 times the official exchange rate to get American dollars, because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So long as the US government stands, we cannot go broke because we have monopoly control of our money. But if we go to crypto, as a bunch of people around Trump want to do, and make it legit for the government, now you have something which is not backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, which is can itself collapse because it's based on nothing. And I've written a number of pieces about the amount of real money people will spend to acquire fake money. It's extraordinary. And at some point, the whole cryptocurrency world will fall apart. I thought it would have happened long before now, but we live in a new environment with the digital age. But the US government has no business being in, and there's no real use for crypto other than fraudulent behavior. It started out, its principal market was drug dealers, vice lords, people engaged in various kinds of tax avoidance or hiding money from business partners and spouses. And there are a number of papers by economists arguing the same thing that I'm saying here. This is not some far out idea among people understand money and economics. That's, I think, the right in the center. And people who think that crypto is going to help us, you have to ask yourself why. Explain the mechanism that you think will improve. Now, the other thing we're going to face is if Donald Trump continues the tax cuts for the richest among us, expands them as he says he's going to do, and gives some tax cuts to people down the income ladder, and increases spending as he will have to do for things like deporting millions of people. There's no way anything can happen to the US government except much more red ink. We could have a $3 trillion red ink annual deficit under Donald Trump in 2 or 3 or 4 years. Elon Musk and Vivek Swamy, I'm mispronouncing his name.
Yeah, right, Vivek Ramaswamy, yeah.
Yes, they're both billionaires, and they make these wild claims that they can cut 25% of the federal budget. Anybody who knows anything about the federal budget knows that's nonsense, because you've got Social Security, Medicare, which Trump promised not to touch. You have the military, which Trump says he wants to spend more money on.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about way over half the budget. When you add in interest, now we're at 75% or so of the federal budget. Now, if you want to shut down the food safety programs in this country, where we inspect food processing plants and we trace things, you can do that up until a bunch of people die one day because the canned beans they ate were dangerous.
Right. There's going to be a lot of closing stuff down, or at least proposing it. And just on that point, and I know that they pull these figures out of their rears, but still, $2 trillion they're going to trim. I mean, this is what Ramaswamy and
out of
Musk
$6 trillion. It is impossible to do that unless you want to do some other things. Now, it could be that Donald Trump will go against what he promised people, and he will radically slash our military. We have 800 plus known U.S. military bases overseas. He could decide to close all of those. He could decide to shrink the size of our military and our civilian military force, which altogether is about 3 million jobs. I don't expect he would do that, but it could be done. And it would also be, depending on your point of view, the end of American dominance or the American empire. Would certainly be welcome by the expansionist leaders of China and Russia, who both want to take over neighboring countries for their own glory.
Well, there's no fat like the Pentagon fat. It's absolutely, it's absurd. I mean, the waste is manifest. It's incalculable, literally. They couldn't audit it, right, David?
Keep in mind that they keep flunking their audits. But
Right.
I suspect the reason for that is that a lot of what appears from the outside to be waste is secretly funded programs. When we were building, we have jet airplanes that can fly at 5 times the speed of sound, and they glow red hot from the friction in the air. Those were secretly funded programs, and so one of the things we don't know is how much of that. Tim Weiner's book on the Pentagon and the black box budget does cite some really terrific examples of how we never paid $675 for a hammer. That was hiding money for some other purpose, which I have fundamental problems with, except in national security. We ought to give the government, since we do live in a very dangerous world, a fair amount of discretion about how much disclosure they make.
You mentioned Ukraine and Russia. You mentioned Russia. I'll mention Ukraine. There has been something of a sea change in our disposition toward use of our missiles over there. Can you speak to that?
I was just on overseas TV talking about this. Joe Biden has been very cautious for almost 3 years in equipping and helping the Ukrainians. He held back on really lethal weapons systems and electronics systems, but especially weapons. Only in the past year have they gotten F-16 fighter jets, for example. By giving the ATACMS missiles, which have a range of about 200 miles, 190 miles, and carry a payload of a little under 500 pounds. They're giving the Ukrainians the weapons to stop Russian incursion or further incursion and help them hang on to the land around Kursk in one of the Russian oblasts. Trump is clearly going to come in and tell the Ukrainians that they have to give up some of their land. And their bargaining chip is, we've got some Russian land. You want land, we'll swap. I think Crimea will continue to be under Russian control because Putin needs a warm water port, one that isn't like Murmansk, locked in ice in the winter. And having Crimea gives him a warm water port in the Black Sea. But you're going to see huge pressure brought to give up land. And the Russians, there's been some renewed talk of the Russians using tactical nuclear weapons. That would be a sign of how weak Putin is. It would provoke an enormous response from Europe, the European members of NATO and Canada, even if Donald Trump sides with Vladimir Putin, as I expect he would do. And so that's, I think, highly unlikely to happen. The Russian army is radically under-equipped. I mean, they are using tanks from World War II. They're using trucks from the Cold War era. And where they would need 100 what are called 6x6 military trucks to move men and equipment, they typically have 1 or 2. And so they concentrate their soldiers, who are almost all conscripts, many of them came out of prisons, in large locations that are vulnerable to attack by the Atacam missiles. And so allowing these missiles, late as it is in the game, should help the Ukrainians minimize losses if they are forced by Trump into surrendering some of their land to Putin. And by the way, we should never forget that Russia signed a treaty promising that if Ukraine would give up the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, they would never invade Ukraine.
Yeah, and we said if they gave it up, we would see to their defense as well if they gave up those nukes.
We absolutely did that. And Putin keeps pushing this argument that Ukraine is really just part of Russia. I'm sorry, 1,000 years ago, Kyiv was a metropolitan city, 1,000 years ago, with maybe 100,000 plus people living there. And Moscow, 1,000 years ago, was literally a couple of huts in the woods. If there's a mother country here, it's Ukraine is the mother of Russia.
Well, it's such an economic engine too. I mean, the power, the agricultural power of Ukraine, and so
manufacturing, mining. A whole bunch of things. And that's, of course, why Putin wants it. But Putin does not just want Ukraine. He is so clearly on the record that he is going to take back Moldova, Slovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, if he can pull it off.
Wow.
And I have by marriage relatives who live in the old former Iron Curtain, and they're very clear. If Putin wins Ukraine, the tanks are coming and they're going to be back under the boot of the Kremlin. So, if you hate freedom and you love dictators, let Putin have his way.
It's going to be, I suppose, alarming on some level to watch Trump's disposition toward Putin and Russia and their designs on, as you suggested, Eastern Europe. So We'll have to see. David, I've kept you, I think, a little bit over time, but I always enjoy our conversations, and I look forward to the next one.
Glad to be here, and I keep hearing from more people who live back east like me about your show. So you're clearly building a larger audience, and I congratulate you on that. And earlier you mentioned about some listeners and viewers not being so happy about the amount of emphasis on politics. They have a point. Nobody would want to read a newspaper in which all the articles were by investigative reporters. You need to have sports. You need to have some light features. You need to have some funny stuff. You need some animal stories. And so I hope, you've done some very funny things that have come on before my appearance in the past. I hope you guys keep that in mind and you build a bigger and bigger audience, because we need you. We need you a lot starting January 20th.
Well, thanks a lot. We will get the equilibrium back. It's just obviously in the ramp up to the election, I think we have been politics heavy. Kim, did you have anything for David?
I saw an article yesterday. I just wanted to run past you really quickly. And it is that seeing as how Trump is not wanting to run background checks on his nominees, there's a
Right.
call now for President Biden to order these background checks before he leaves office so that it could get the ball rolling on these background checks, give these senators some type of background information when these nominees come before them. Is that realistic?
Biden is something of a Boy Scout. It's been one of the biggest problems with his administration. Merrick Garland, a totally decent man, but who slow walked investigating Trump and some other things until he had very solid material to justify what he was doing. I would be surprised if he does that. Under the Supreme Court immunity decision, there are a whole bunch of things that Biden could do right now. I don't think those are going to happen. Biden is got a secure place in history, and unlike Donald Trump, cares about his legacy. He has been the economically most successful president since Lyndon Baines Johnson, and arguably more successful than Johnson, despite all the people who believe the nonsense that the economy is in the toilet. 107% of the jobs are going to people who came out of the jails in Venezuela. Just see the stories that came out today about how overloaded the Orlando airport is. People only go to Orlando for either a convention or vacation. It's not a manufacturing center. It's not Detroit or Cleveland or Cincinnati or even Rochester. And our economy is doing fabulously. And I don't think Biden is going to do anything to upset his place in the pantheon of American presidents at this stage of the game.
He's definitely an institutionalist. You're right about that.
Yeah.
And you're right about Garland. He's just, he's the gold medalist of slow walking. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you, David. Look forward to next week. David K. Johnston, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.